Fellow Rotarians, we're running a bit late, so I'm going to cut this down to the bones. It's my privilege this afternoon to introduce to you somebody many of you already know, because she is a member of this club, Rotarian Kate Brophy McGee. Kate's been an outstanding member of Arizona's population in the last 10 years and 20 years actually, distinguishing herself in areas of education and child welfare. She served on the Arizona School Facilities Board, of being appointed by a Republican governor and then reappointed by a Democrat governor and then appointed chairman by that Democrat governor. Before that, she served on the school board. In 2008, she was elected to the State House of Representatives and served in the House and then in the Senate until the beginning of 2019. Most recently, she received the 2021 Mercy Care Rise Lifetime Achievement Award for her reforms of child welfare and Arizona's Medicaid program. She continues to commit herself to our state in the areas of education and child welfare. Please join me in welcoming Kate Brophy McGee.
And you're a hard act to follow. Holy smokes. I've been to a fair number of Rotary meetings. Matt, I still hope you'll join. Seriously, I was so impressed, fellow Rotarians, with what just went down. And that's what makes this Rotary Club really, really special. I will confess that I've been to at least one other Rotary Club during my tenure, and it's a group of young men and women who are equally committed to public service and making things better here in the state and the world. So I was asked to talk about Arizona K-12 education, focusing on the 2021 session. And there are two ways to put it. You have challenges, you have opportunities. And every challenge produced an opportunity, and every opportunity produced a challenge. So this is going to be very high level, very brief, and hopefully allow for plenty of time for questions and answers. The opportunities and challenges for the 2021 session were based off the pandemic, which has produced, and I think will continue to produce, some tectonic shifts in education. The conversion kind of overnight to online instruction, which typically did not go very well for most schools and most students. The curtailed sports and extracurricular activities, the canceled proms, the lost opportunities for socialization, the missed graduations, and you pile all of this on top of family stressors, job loss, lots of things going on. It really hit home, and that was the challenge. I will continue to emphasize throughout this speech that the underserved, socioeconomically disadvantaged communities fared the worst. The impact of COVID, the pandemic, and the shutdown on them was outsized. It's referred to as the COVID slide, where they lost basically a year's worth of education. At the same time, the pandemic produced some opportunities. Parents began taking a real interest in their child's education, and many of them were home with their child, watching what they were being taught and how they were being taught. The essential workers had to go to work. The Boys and Girls Clubs and other care facilities stepped up to assist with the schools shutting down. Parents began to get involved in local governments, and I'm looking at Mr. King, who preceded me on the Washington School Board, and you know and I know that can be really, really messy. But man, is it
Just like this.
Yeah, I remember when we had to move the meeting to the gymnasium because there were so many people who were coming, and they were so angry. They weren't coming to tell us we were doing a good job. So all this that you're seeing across the state and across the country is actually good. We need parents to be involved. And they began providing real-time feedback to their legislators about what they wanted to see in terms of education policy and funding. So let's talk a little bit about policy. Massive, massive amounts of policy, legislation, ways to do things went down in the 2021 session. I will talk about just 2 changes. The challenges in the policy forefront, the disagreements between the Republicans and the Democrats over the next steps forward, in my perception, continue to be at an even higher all-time high. And this was exacerbated by the 1-vote margins in the House and in the Senate. And that meant throughout the session that on any given day, you could be Senate President or House Speaker as a member of the legislature. And that dynamic played out throughout the session. And I have to bring up the distraction of the Senate audit. Whether you agree with the audit or whether you don't, it was a hideous distraction. So those were the challenges. So what were the opportunities? My guest, Mr. Matt Simon of Education Think Tank will tell you that there was tremendous stakeholder work that was done throughout the session, and it created some wonderful, meaningful policies. They benefited underserved students, benefited their families, and a booming Arizona economy meant there was actually money to pay for implementing those programs. So one of the most exciting things for me was the transportation grants, which was $30 million that was appropriated so that districts and charter schools can pay parents to transport their child to school. Yeah, we've got the school buses, but you may have a collection or 1 or 2 students where the parents want them to go to this school and they choose this school, they can't get the child there, so you could arrange for carpools. The districts and the charters would reimburse for that. That's a very exciting, flexible wave of the future, in my opinion. I'm anxious to see how that policy implements, and it was funded. Transparency, and that's why my friend Matt Simon of Great Schools,
Great Leaders, Strong Schools.
Great Leaders, Strong Schools, I'll never get it right, but he is a great leader, and he is an education wonk, and he worked very hard on transparency. In 2017, the legislature passed a bill requiring school districts and individual schools to start providing financial information and reporting at the school level. It's not been something we've ever had. The task was assigned to the Department of Education. They worked on it for 3 years and they really didn't get there. But this session, Matt and his crew and others worked on a parent or a portal, a school-based, school-level portal. And it meant, I've got my documentation here, what it means is you could go to a specific school in a specific district, you could click on it, and you could see every dollar that went to that school, federal, state, local, what the per student count was, how those dollars were spent. It finally finishes, you're looking excited, Mr. King, it finally finishes the back end of the question. When the money goes to the school district or the charter schools, how does it get spent? It answers that question. The bill appropriated $6 million over the next 3 years, and it moved the whole function to the Department of Administration, which is really more the technology home for state agencies. And on a one-click basis, you're going to be able to toggle back and forth, compare schools as a taxpayer, as a parent, as a community member. You're going to get to see how these schools are financed and where the money goes. I would be remiss if I didn't talk as part of that about the billions of dollars that have flowed to the schools throughout the country from the federal government for COVID mitigation strategies. We would be able to see that if that and how that COVID mitigation money was spent if that portal was up and operating. Hopefully it will be up and operating in the next 2 to 3 years. It's really, really exciting. So the next and last section of my speech, talking about funding and talking about budget. Again, challenges and opportunities. The challenge is there was lots and lots of money. You're all looking at me, why is that a challenge? Because I spent pretty much 8 or 9 of the 10 years that I spent in the legislature fighting over not enough money for priorities. And then along came the last 2 years and we had money. Those fights were way worse. Way worse. They were awful. So it's a challenge. And it was really exacerbated by the politics that have been ramping up as the margins in the House and the Senate get closer and closer, and the Democrats get closer and closer to flipping the chambers, as they say. It has created a zero-sum game between Republicans and Democrats for control of the legislature. Total disagreements on how best to fund education, total disagreement as to policy, I mentioned that before, complete and total disagreement on how well education is funded, and total disagreement on the value and growth of school choice. Now let's do this little thing called tax cuts and stack it on top, and you can see that you've got kind of a recipe for a lot of big fighting. So what were the opportunities that made this, in my friend Matt Simon's words, one of the best policy and funding sessions in 20 years for parents and for school choice? Because there were many innovative, flexible, targeted funding policies that were put forward that benefited low-income families, which is always closest to my heart, benefited early learners, benefited and grew the teacher workforce, benefited gifted learners and special education. I'm gonna take a little side note here and shatter the myth. Arizona does not rank last or even 49th in per pupil funding. If you've heard it, you've heard it, you've heard it. We don't. It's an apples to oranges comparison. Like I said, it's my last stop. And you're gonna laugh, but the next place I'm going is hair salons. Just have to explain to me. So anyway, we do not rank last in the nation, or even close to it. We actually, if you add in all the state, local, federal, property taxes, sales taxes, gaming, all the different sources of funding, we actually wind up somewhere in the middle. So it really is a false flag. It's time for us, past time for us to quit talking about what a terrible job Arizona does educating their students and start talking about the good things that we do. And as I no longer have a dog in the hunt, I'm telling you, that's what we must do and should do. So there are 2 types of funding when we think about education finance. You have the district or administrative level funding to charter schools, and that's where you take the money and say, district, charter school, here's the money, spend it as you see fit. 2 great examples of that were the 20 by 2020 pay increase that you saw for teachers went to the districts, and to the charters. It was intended for pay increases. Some of the teachers didn't get 20%. That's because the district located other priorities. A lot of them chose to pay all their staff, not just the teachers, give all their staff raises. Another example of district, or what I call education monolith funding, is the Prop 123 funds, the increased disbursement from the state land trust. Then you have the program funding that has gotten more and more to be the case, that actually bypasses the district structure and goes straight to the problem they're trying to solve. Whether it's performance pay, whether it's special education funding. We had a $50 million special education fund that was set up for districts who are dealing with high needs students. You have dollars for kindergarten entry evaluation. You have dollars for teacher reading instruction exams. You have money that's specifically set aside for literacy coaches. Again, in these high needs, low-income schools, that's exactly what's needed, and that's exactly where it's needed. One last example I will give you is my last session in the legislature. We expanded and enhanced behavioral health in the schools. one of the things that we found is that providing counseling to students in the school, oftentimes, first of all, you have 100% show rate for appointments. Second of all, you can bring the family there, and it is an enormously flexible and good way to. Your team chat is going on.
I'm so sorry.
No. You want to move it? Am I starting it?
No, it's
Kick 'em.
I'm just turning the.
That sounds like it could. Oh, as long as you muted it, not me. So anyway, if you hear the complaint that we have 900 students to one counselor, or highest student to counselor ratio, understand we have come up with a flexible and innovative way to fund behavioral health in schools by partnering with behavioral health agencies and providing treatment in the schools and getting to the students sooner. So it's one thing if you have a student who's having kind of a hard time, maybe getting picked on a little bit. The range of mental health, behavioral health problems we run into in schools is this big. So if you can address it there, give them some help, somebody to talk to, that's great. But if you have a fourth grader or third grader who's having suicidal ideations, you gotta get him the help too, or her. So it's an enormously flexible way to provide targeted funding where the help is most needed at the school where it's most needed. But that's one of those policy and implementation and delivery debates between the Democrats and the Republicans. I will tell you that having worked on both sides of that, this is a far better way to implement behavioral health and counseling service in the schools. So, the key takeaways I can say is Governor Ducey and those evil Republicans have in fact put $6.2 billion into education funding. That's a lot. And schools are awash in funding. $4.2 billion from the federal government to mitigate COVID impacts. Well, this money is technically one-time money. It doesn't go away till 2024. So that's a pretty healthy bridge. My message to you is that the challenges that were brought forward by the pandemic has resulted in some amazing innovations, some emergence of parent involvement, which is, while messy, something that is really needed at every level in our education system. The confirming of parent choice. We had a marketing plan we were trying to develop when I was on the Washington School Board. We were trying to figure out our mission statement. And I remember the facilitator came in and was talking to the governing board members and said, "Who's your customer? You're the school district, who's your customer?" One board member raised their hand and said, "The teachers." Another board member raised their hand and said, "The students, the children." The answer is the parents. They are the ones who choose to put the children in your school. And so you have to create an environment that supports parent choice, attracts the kids there, and you have the type of programming that makes that happen. I mean, Washington had some amazing special education programs and some amazing gifted programs and some very high-performing Title I schools, which are high-poverty schools. So we did it well, and we can, again, the debate between clear policy differences, clear funding differences, to the public education structure as opposed to the targeted funding will continue, but I cannot stress enough that the transparency legislation, assuming we can get that involved, will really seriously begin to answer those questions better and more completely. I am such a believer that you are entitled to your opinion, and it can be different than mine, but none of us are entitled to our own set of facts. We gotta work from the truth. We gotta work from where we are, not where we need to be to get a vote or to do whatever. I did this whole speech and didn't talk one time about masks.
That's coming.
And just assuming there'll be questions about it, but that policy debate is ongoing, and everybody's got their opinion. I'm so happy to answer any questions. Roger, Angela, if I do have time, I'd love to take some questions.
Got about 18 minutes. If somebody here asks a question, if you could just repeat it so that people on Zoom
Yes.
can hear you. And then if you want to open the chat in the Zoom, the people can ask you questions via the chat.
Well, let me let you open the chat. It looks like Zoom is still awake.
I shall to answer your questions. Yes, we're taking questions. You go ahead and put it in the chat. Kate can see the chat here.
Okay.
And then go ahead and just send them.
Yeah, put your Zoom people put your questions in the chat box, and let's start with Joe.
Thank you for coming today. It was very educational. Funding at the school level used to be based on how many kids were enrolled and how much attendance. Is that still the case? How did they deal with that in COVID?
Well, I have an interesting kind of one paragraph synopsis about why school funding is basically simple, but then it gets very complicated. What happened when we shut down during the pandemic with the thought that we'd be back is we kept the school structure intact, and we paid everybody. We paid the teachers to instruct per Zoom. There were a few children that came into the school because they didn't have any facilities at home. So we paid the bus drivers. We paid everybody with the idea of keeping the team intact, and then we could reopen. I think we funded it at 100%, although online instruction is typically funded at 95%. Subsequent to that, I got caught up in the demands of the campaign. I have absolutely no idea what we did starting in September, but what I kept encountering wherever I went was parents' dissatisfaction. I live in Sunny Slope, and it's demographically, economically very diverse. Parents were beside themselves because it looked like the schools weren't going to reopen. And both parents worked, and both parents needed to work outside the home, and the employer was tired of accommodating their split schedules. So they finally did go back to school. Most went back to teach. I did find an outlier school district, Deer Valley, that was open pretty much the whole time. And a lot of charter schools were open the entire time. And so what I saw parents doing, talked to a parent whose son was in Sunny Slope High School, which is a fabulous high school, and his son was not doing well on online learning. So he took him out and he put him over in Valley Lutheran, and the son got to go to school and experience that in-person instruction and socialization, and he has blossomed. But it was a diaspora, I guess is what I would call it. Yes.
I hope my question isn't too complicated, but Prop 208 looks like it's going to become law now, and also the legislature took up a similar type of funding legislation to lessen the effects of Prop 208. I'm really confused by all of this. Can you explain it in a nutshell, or is it confusing to everyone?
Well, first of all, there was a Supreme Court ruling yesterday that put Prop 208 in doubt because Prop 208, part of how they worded it, and they were told by legislative counsel, when the wording went up, that they thought that was going to be a problem with constitutionality. They used the word grant because spending and appropriations, there is a cap, a constitutional cap that was established by the voters to education spending. So the Supreme Court found that the use of the word grant was not correct, that in fact it was under the constitutional cap for spending on education, and sent it back to the lower court asking the question, does the amount that is predicted to come from Prop 208, is that gonna exceed the limit? Because then you need to change the limit. So it's in doubt, and it's kind of a celebrity death match on both sides as to whether or not that proposition will survive. Another thing that happened, and I'm gonna show my bias here, I'll fully declare it. It was targeted as a wealth tax, or an envy tax is what I call it. And it was said that it doesn't impact small businesses. But in fact, it very much impacted small businesses, because people who own small businesses file their personal income tax returns. So it's gonna impact the behavior of the small businesses that are crawling out of the pandemic and are finding a way to thrive. Again, having a hard time hiring people, but it's just very, very contentious. And that's why I'm saying, let's stick with the facts, have the policy disagreements all day long, and I'm good with that, but stick with the facts. I hope I answered your question. Oh, one last thing is, for years, this factoid has been going out, and it's even put out by the Center for Economic Progress, which was chaired by David Wuhan, saying that 63% of Arizona corporations pay only $50 a year in taxes. Matter of fact, my friend, my acquaintance, Senator Juan Mendez, introduces a bill every year that never gets a hearing, saying it needs to go to 500 minimum tax. Well, what that $50 is a CorpCom filing fee for the LLC or sub-S or whatever it is. It's a CorpCom filing fee. It's not a tax. The tax is reported, I'm seeing a lot of small business owners shake their heads, yes, is on their personal income tax returns. So we've got to go back to, yes, we need to fund education, but let's talk about how much we're funding it. And more importantly, now that so much money has gone into it, how is it being spent?
Kate, there's also,
chat.
Jake Adams on the chat.
Can you read it?
Kate, thank you for your leadership, especially on issues children in Arizona face. Can you talk about discrepancy in outcomes for children in some districts versus other districts? Typically, income of the school. The Phoenix Chamber Workforce and Education Committee is very concerned about vastly different outcomes for students.
So the question is asking about the discrepancy in outcomes for children in some districts versus other districts, and typically the income the school receives. And apparently there's a Phoenix Chamber Workforce and Education Committee is working on this. What I would suggest is that you have another speech just on this, and have someone like Mr. Simon or somebody from that workforce come and talk to you about it. You can have different reasons why different schools receive different amounts of money. In the Washington Elementary School District, for instance, Sweetwater School and Moon Mountain School are high special ed kids, and their rates are greater. They receive more money from the state and from the federal government because they have identified special needs. So the average student per student amount going to the school is going to be more. But the other question you need to do is say, the money that goes to the district, how is it spent? Where does it go? And I go back to this transparency bill, which I didn't even know it passed until it passed. And I said, oh my God, this is fabulous.
So
Yes.
Kate, I used to teach educational sociology at the graduate level for NAU, and I had a lot of principals and superintendents and teachers in my classes, and they all talk, and all the research shows that it's very important for parents to be involved in schools.
Yes.
But guess what? You try to volunteer for your school, and they hide behind FERPA, and they don't want you coming in the classrooms, and they've really shut it down. And so I would ask my students, why are you doing this? And they would say, well, there's always that parent that gets really nosy. And I said, but that's no excuse. You know that parental involvement increases student success. So how do we, and you've seen these videos where people are going to school board meetings and they're getting shut down and shut out. How do parents assert their rights to really get involved?
So the question for the Zoom audience is why parents want to get involved. but it's very hard for them oftentimes to get involved, and what can we do about that? Well, I think it needs to, there are a couple of things. The worst thing that can happen as a school board member is to look out in the audience and see not a parent. And all you see are the special interest groups, the teachers union representatives, the administrative representatives, and pretty much all the information you get on the school board is what the administration decides you need to make your decision. So I think part of shopping for a school, looking for a school, is to look for schools that are parent friendly and have figured out a way to cut through the red tape and the ribbons related to parent participation. I have a pretty high needs school just up the street from me, and I volunteered there for many years till the pandemic hit. They have figured out a way to get parents involved, and a lot of their parents are not here legally, but they have a PTA, they have different tasks, and they have a really, really hardworking social worker who is able to identify specific needs for students, everything from underwear to food to you name it. It can be done, but I think it means going back to the school board members who are just offended that anybody would come and yell at them. The only thing worse for me was being my HOA president.
I've never done that.
It was great training. They need to sit down with their parents and figure out a way to see if there can be a fit, if there can be policy change. What can they do to involve parents constructively? Honestly, yes.
Go ahead.
I take care of about 300 kids a year at the shelter, and my wife was a first grade school teacher for 32 years. Yesterday she came home for dinner, and she was very upset.
Yeah.
Because she had, with some team members, tested about 118 second graders. And of the 118 second graders, 70 of them did not know their letters, all of their letters. And she says, what's going to happen to these children in second grade who don't even know their letters? I don't hear conversation in the schools and things about competency and what has been taken away from these children. Do you have any thoughts about how this is, the content side of this learning is going to be addressed?
I have a lot of thoughts, and again, COVID was just a horrible, disparate impact on those populations. You have to get a kid up and reading and just there by the end of third grade, or you're gonna lose that kid. So I would recommend, not sure where the shelter is, but I would recommend that you reach out specifically for additional resources. It's like the social worker who was the one left of all the Arcadia, Alhambra schools, who saw the high need for behavioral health and went to Touchstone and said, we gotta figure this out, and figured out a way to get Touchstone and in each of their schools and dealing with students on that spectrum. I would recommend that too, and I would recommend, it usually is somebody on site, and to your volunteer question, somebody on site who generates that connection to break down that silo to get to that funding source or that resource to help those children.
One more question or two quick questions?
Okay, I was involved with Social Venture Partners, and we work with Camelback High and Phoenix Union School District, and Chad Gustafson, I don't know if you know who Chad Gustafson is, he's the superintendent. Chad made the comment one time, he says, when I get up in the morning, my kids have their lunch prepared to take to school. They know what clothes they're gonna have, they're gonna wear. They know how they're gonna get to school.
Mm-hmm.
He said approximately 80% of the kids in the Phoenix Union High School District can't make that statement. They're so poor that they don't know how they're gonna get to school. They don't have the lunch, have lunch prepared. They don't have the proper clothes to wear. So the poverty in South Phoenix is very, very great. And I don't think many people, like all of us who live generally in the northern part of town or outside of in the suburbs, realize.
Well, and Phoenix Union, it's kind of interesting because they truly are and have been one of the most well-funded high school, they have the highest teacher salaries in the state, bar none.
They need it.
So they do.
Because of
But
the
then
poor
the
kids.
question becomes, how are you engaging with those kids? How are you getting there? And again, I would go to the transparency to better understand. I know where Superintendent Justin's heart is and what he wants to do. And the question is, how is it being implemented? What can we do to support that? What can we do to make sure those children have what they need to succeed? Because truly, the one differential, the one thing they can do for themselves is to get an education, get that high school degree. But you still can walk into I would walk into a school on the west side of Phoenix Union School and watch the counselors directing the kids over to childcare classes and weightlifting classes. When they're in that building is a master teacher who, if you can learn computer coding and take and pass the 2 AP courses that go with it, you can walk out of a high school with a high school degree and start at $60,000. So those opportunities exist. We have to figure out why, in some cases, they're not getting there. That's our biggest challenge. Yes? I've been picking on you, Mike, the whole time, so.
You and I have always agreed that just more money doesn't ensure better outcomes.
Yes.
Do you see any prospect for people now getting that message and understanding that you need to change the delivery method, you need to change the engagement with the community?
Well, I'm gonna go back to what I talked about on the policy side. There are so many worthwhile programs, worthwhile education policy groups, like Matt's group, like A for Arizona, like Helios. And there are wonderful programs out there that are being implemented and they are working. It is imperative we start talking about it and recognizing that, not just how terrible Republicans are and what a crappy job they do funding education. We have to get past that conversation and really drill down on what really matters, the kids. They have to get that education, and if you're from a wealthier household or a safer community, your parents have resources to get tutoring, to get you the assistance that you need, they're home. They can support. So you really need to focus on those high need schools, and there is a lot of good work going on. I would recommend a future program to talk about successes like that here in Phoenix.
Fantastic.
I'll tell you what, if we get $5,000 today, I'll take a pie in the face today.
Stand up, Mike. Stand up. Lisa, would you go in the kitchen and see if you can find a pie?
I'll buy it if necessary.
Okay, well, so, all right, so let's say, assuming that Lisa gets the pie, yes?
I'll do the first 1,000.
There's first 1,000, very much, great. Thank you very much.
I'll do the second.
She gets to swing the pie. She does not get to throw it at me.
That's two. Okay, that's two.
Oh, great. I'll do
The third, Joe will do the third.
I'll take a pie.
All right, Stevie.
Four?
Yep.
Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Mike, you want to come stand up here, Mike?
Oh, we heard a Zoom. Back here.
Wow.
Somebody on Zoom. Somebody on
Oh,
Zoom.
yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna clear out.
Lizzie? 1,000?
I heard someone on Zoom.
Is that 5?
Oh, is there somebody on Zoom too?
Hey, we got $5,000. Are you ready for this pie?
Tony Serrano, do 1,000.
That's
6,000. Whoa!
Yeah.
Do we have a?
Maybe they won't find the pie.
Oh, sure. Come on up here.
Oh, is that a
Come on up, let's go.
Come on, Mike.
Come on.
He's a good sport, Lizzie, don't worry.
Here we go. Here we go. $6,000 times. $6,000.